At the helm of most adventure games, you typically have some fumbling, happenstance hero ushered onto a path of glory as a world-saving warrior. Legacy of the Wizard for NES smashes those conventions and puts an entire destined family to the task of preventing an evil dragon from returning to the world's surface. The fabled Dragon Slayer weapon is the only thing that can kill the beast once and for all, but it's locked away deep within an underground maze and can only be accessed after collecting 4 crowns that seal it away to keep it safe. To find the crowns and ultimately the sword, the family of 4, along with their pet Pochi, will have to wander through the peril-filled caverns to hopefully keep their world from being ravaged by dragonfire once again. Hitting start teleports you to the Drazzle family's home, where everyone's sitting around the kitchen table patiently awaiting your decision on who to take down into the dungeon first. Of the 7, only 5 are playable, with the 2 grandparent characters serving as a means to get a password or load a game. After choosing a character and taking a short walk through a peaceful forest, the quest for the 4 crowns begins by descending a ladder into a huge, interconnected labyrinth that's practically in the backyard of the woodcutter's family home. This place is huge. An overview of the whole thing might seem overwhelming, and rightfully so. The way will be paved with many battles to win, obstacles to overcome, and puzzles to solve, but there's plenty of fun to be had as well. If you're wondering which family member to take out for a spin first, there's really no right answer. Pochi, the family's pet monster, is immune to enemy attacks if you're looking to get a feel for what's out there without the threat of dying looming over your every move, but you can start with almost anyone. Something to consider is that every character has advantages and disadvantages in the dungeon because of their differing strength stats, projectile reach, and jumping heights. This limits which parts they can access at first and establishes the biggest challenge of the game, discovering where each family member can get to and then surviving long enough to get there. There are many dead ends to uncover, since each person can only get so far without treasure items that grant them powerful skills like moving or breaking boulders, jumping extra high, or being able to stomp on enemies rather than using magic to kill them. Most of these items are found in chests or bought at shops, but some of the best ones are extremely well hidden. In a first playthrough, stumbling upon the glove, for example, might push you to explore a little further with Xemn, or finding the Matic will get you kickstarted with Lyll. My initial playthrough was guided entirely by which treasure objects I found while wandering, and then cross-referencing with the manual to see who could use them. I'm sure I didn't play it the same way that someone that knows the game really well would, but being able to tackle the adventure from several different angles makes it more approachable for a broader audience, with no real wrong way to play. The instruction manual removed all mystery around which items were for which person and how they can be used. Honestly, if you play Legacy of the Wizard, I'd highly recommend getting a copy of the booklet, since without question, it was one of the most helpful for the NES that I've ever encountered. It has accurate descriptions of every object you can pick up, a colorful bestiary, and most importantly, lots of hints and information that were actually helpful. Compared to many of the NES manual missteps of the day, it's a very well written and informative gem. Now, apart from the overwhelming size of the dungeon itself, the thing I was worried about the most starting up was that everything that you do in Legacy of the Wizard is tied to something consumable. Having a life meter is pretty normal, and so are limited keys for chests and locked doors, but the scariest was the magic meter. Whenever you fire a projectile at an enemy, you lose 1 tick off of it, and if you're trigger happy like me, that's a problem. Luckily, replenishing items drop from almost every single enemy you kill, and the game is always somehow in tune with what you need. Whenever I was low on health or magic, for example, bread and potions seemed to show up more often, with the exception of a few times where I was being particularly wasteful or had gotten myself completely lost. I never needed to spend time farming out items. Even in the most dire of straits, there was always an inn to be found nearby, and these completely refill health and magic for a very reasonable price. Legacy of the Wizard is very fair to a brand new explorer, and becomes even more so after you carve out a familiar path to take on subsequent journeys down into the depths. Despite the fact that the dungeon is crawling with monsters that constantly respawn, becoming a good fighter isn't the only skill that you'll need to succeed. Having a keen eye for potential secrets and a memory of steel to remember odd things to investigate later are crucial. There's not a single NPC to talk to for hints, so it's all up to you and your problem-solving skills to pave your own way. A good, albeit cliché rule of thumb is that things aren't always as they seem. Roadblocks might need to be bypassed by a different person or a special item that you might not have yet, or the solution might require thinking outside the box a bit. Jumping on top of enemies to reach places I couldn't get to on my own was occasionally viable, or sometimes I just walked from corner to corner to see if there was a hidden passageway somewhere below my feet. If this feels tedious, I'd say it's no more so than bombing every wall or burning every tree in The Legend of Zelda looking for secrets. There are more parameters to consider with Legacy of the Wizard, but there's far more common sense involved rather than mindlessly brute forcing your way into the secrets behind walls and trees. Every obstacle type here is tied directly to a specific family member's special abilities, and some careful consideration of each person's treasure items will almost always nudge you in the right direction. When you finally do find a new path, it's extremely gratifying, and you're always rewarded with more of the puzzle to piece together. I personally adore this kind of gameplay, and with enough trial and error and resolve, anyone can make it. While the physical contents and layouts of the rooms will provide some great hints about just who should be journeying through which areas, another very noteworthy thing is how much the music itself reveals. The manual tells of 5 major sections of the dungeon, and there are also 5 playable characters to go adventuring with. Each song actually belongs to a different character, and once you figure out who's connected to which, everything will really start to click. It goes without saying that Legacy of the Wizard has one of the best soundtracks on the NES, but the way that it weaves into the gameplay is incredibly special and definitely deepened the experience for me. I know I've had a lot of good things to say so far, but the trip down into the dungeon was not always rosy. The playable characters control pretty smoothly, but Xemn's block manipulation was one thing that nearly sent me into a rage a few times. I found the glaive pretty early on and concentrated on finding a way forward with him before really exploring any of the other paths. I feel like Xemn's area is one of the most trying in the whole game. Trudging through the hardest part first made the other sections feel a lot more enjoyable when I finally got around to them, but the struggle around block physics severely impeded my enjoyment for a little while. The challenge here is twofold. First, you have to figure out which positions to move the blocks into so that you can get to where you want to go. Some of these situations are more complex than others, and personally, I'm not great at physical puzzles when there are so many moving parts to consider. It's hard for me to visualize a solution. The second part is actually maneuvering the blocks once you have a plan worked out, and the means to do this is borderline nightmarish. Despite the seemingly easy instructions of holding A and pressing the direction that you want the block to go with the D-pad, I accidentally pushed them away from myself or moved them in the wrong direction more than I moved them correctly. This resulted in many missed jumps and falls, followed by a long walk of shame to reset a room and try again. This is how I mainly spent the first few evenings with Legacy of the Wizard, and it wasn't pretty. The manual has an entire page dedicated to detailing how to use the glaive to move blocks, so they knew it was going to be tricky for people to pick up. Even by the end of the game, with lots of practice, I still had a hard time with it. There are plenty of scary traps that can totally derail your progress, like falling through fake blocks into a horrible spike pit or running into invisible enemies that can kill you almost instantly if you don't get away quickly enough. As horrible as it felt to have unpredictable deaths foisted upon me deep inside the dungeon, every trip back down the ladder from the Drazzle home was a lesson in resource management and an opportunity to learn something new or try something different. While roaming, one thing I didn't particularly care for were the jarring screen transitions that made vertical travel harder than it should have been. Blindly jumping up to a platform into a screen above was impossible to execute reliably, and the few times that I fell from a high place, I rocketed downward like a boulder careening into the bottom of a lake. There was no time to react to save yourself, and there was always trouble brewing to deal with wherever you happened to faceplant. I haven't mentioned the fall damage yet. It's really not all that bad in terms of health management for all the reasons I mentioned earlier, but the most irritating part was how vulnerable you are to enemy attacks while you're frozen for that moment with your legs in the air. While some dungeon dwellers don't pay much attention to you, lots of them can hone in on your character. These standoffs can be brutal in close quarters, and because foes also constantly respawn if you kill them, there's an urgency to keep moving at all times so you don't get surrounded and overwhelmed. The enemy designs were also pretty cool. While there were the suspect bats, snakes, and scorpions, there were also Sambo Hannas, Hoagies, and Biffs to battle, or these enemies that look like someone bent over to wink at you. What appeared to be a bunch of cat ladies in one particular section definitely won the day for me in terms of sprite work. They're super cute, and I hated murdering them when they got in my way. Bosses, also known as the big monsters in Legacy of the Wizard, were immensely tough to take down, especially as the game went on. Most of them spew projectiles at a rate that's nearly impossible to keep up with, and there are very few truly safe spots to hang back in since each playable character's attack range is quite short. The shield was invaluable for my own personal success since it completely blocks projectiles in these fights, and there's no way I could have made it through this game without it. Something that really bothered me about these frays was the boss health bar and how misleading it was. When I was giving it all I had in terms of an offensive, in later battles the health meter didn't even look like it was depleting. It turns out that the master monsters sometimes have more health than what the meter actually shows, so even if you're hurting them, you're not getting any feedback that you are. As a first-time player thinking that my shots were missing the target, I'd often get a little closer and accidentally put myself in harm's way just to make sure I was actually dealing damage. This never ended well for me. Eventually seeing those ticks start to fly off the end was always a huge relief, but I wish they would have just given the bosses a more appropriate health bar or some kind of other clue that damage was actually being inflicted. One thing that I could have done without in Legacy of the Wizard was the soft locking. There were a few places that you can get yourself permanently stuck, especially in Xemn's area involving those blocks. One time when I was trying to get through a room with a bunch of cat lady enemies, I ended up pushing a block and accidentally obstructing a ladder that I needed to use, but I was also too far down a pit to jump back out. Xemn's giant frown spoke the feelings I had inside my heart in that moment because I also didn't have the crystal item to teleport back up to the house. I was stuck. I had to reset and I lost at least an hour of progress, but it wasn't the end of the world. These are the kinds of things that you can't see coming until they've already happened to you, and I would have appreciated some other way around these level design flaws. At least these situations were rare. Legacy of the Wizard is easily one of the most fun puzzles I've ever had the pleasure of untangling. It has a bit of everything that people love in adventure games, like good action, lots of strategy, a captivating story, and puzzles galore. While it does suffer from some problems with control in certain areas, overall I think this game was extremely ambitious but has unfortunately flown under the radar for many lovers of the NES library. While playing through this one, I constantly heard from people that this game was one that they played when they were younger but never knew what to do or how to get anywhere. While those memories might feel intimidating, it's really not so bad once you understand each character and their skill sets. I truly feel that if you love games like The Legend of Zelda, where leaving no stone unturned is a requirement to win the day, you'll also fall madly in love with this one too. After all, it is Vaxanity's cousin, and that makes it a winner in my book.